Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Psychology of Spending. My name is Kelly Blount, and I'm the Program Marketing Specialist here at General Electric Credit Union. We're so glad you've joined us. We have a lot of great content ahead, and we wanted to thank you all for tuning in from the comfort of wherever you may be joining from today. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Todd Moore, the Director of Education with Trinity Debt Management, to introduce himself and take us through today's topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today on this chilly January afternoon. Hopefully you got something nice and warm to keep you comfort as we move through the webinar today. We've got some really great content today. I believe, very interesting topic. Something that I've had an interest in for a long time, looking at the psychology of spending, how we make financial decisions, how we reason about financial decisions. So I'm hoping this afternoon we can cover some of this content, lay out some of the theory and how you can practice once you've got a better understanding of how these theories function, how you can apply these ideas and make better decisions in the coming year. So to get us started, I wanted us for a moment to, thinking about the psychology of spending, just to take a snapshot of some recent economic findings, and particularly when we're looking at spending and savings rates, and just look at some of the current statistics and how that might challenge our thinking about the psychology of spending. So let me go through a couple slides here as we introduce some of these economic factors. So we all know in the last couple years, I almost hate to say the word COVID-19 at this point, but we went through a period where there was we had some stimulus money, gave us some savings to offset downward pressure on the economy and job losses, those sorts of things. And then we also moved into a period of inflation, which we're currently in. And I was looking at a Bankrate survey that 48% of adults say they wouldn't have enough to cover 3 months of expenses. This was a current Bankrate survey. And then 36% of those people were also saying that they have more credit card debt that they've had in years, the highest percentage under this Bankrate survey in 12 years. So we know the COVID funds, those are gone. Personal savings have started to decline, inflation, and then just overall emergency savings and credit card debt certainly on the rise. In addition, the Bankrate survey looking at 25% of those surveyed saying that to pay for an unexpected $1,000 expense, they would have to use a credit card, to do that. There's just not enough cash at this point to pay those expenses. Others would say that they would be worried. They wouldn't be able to cover living expenses for a month if they lost a primary source of income tomorrow. Also 45% saying they'd be very worried. So there's a lot of concern in terms of just losing funds and where our overall savings is at this time. We also find a similar statistic when it comes to just retirement preparedness. We know that these things are being driven by certainly the economy at this point. Folks are concerned about money and making investments at this time, but Fidelity did a lot of research on this. 57% of respondents expressed concern about losing their savings by investing too aggressively. And then I also looked at some further statistics from the Federal Reserve Bank. Americans right now owe, in the aggregate, over $1 trillion in credit card debt. And this is the largest increase since 1999. And I know here at Trinity, we've been seeing very high interest rates, as high as 37%. And that, for me, I've been working in credit counseling for almost 17 years now. That is certainly the highest that I've ever seen on record. And credit card balances, why do they keep rising? Despite cost, what we're seeing is despite the cost, the interest rates, folks are continuing to use those cards. Some of this is supplemental, but what we're finding is that regardless, folks are using cards and the balances continue to increase. Credit card delinquency rates are on the rise, and particularly those who are 30, 39 years old, that age bracket. We know student loans are back online, so folks are being challenged with student loan repayment, and we're seeing an increase in credit card delinquencies. So I paint this broad picture about some of the economic factors that are currently at play. These things in different ways. I think all of us are in some way experience some type of financial hardship. And we certainly have seen, again, decreased savings, increased levels of debt. And why does all this matter? So analysts, academics have been watching these falling rates, and we're all really trying to figure this out. We know that savings is declining. We know debt is there. Savings is gone, and I just went through several statistics, but why does all this really matter? What's the bottom line? What we can say is that there's more to this story. Regardless of what people say about their views on the economy, low savings rate is a statistical confirmation that many consumers are feeling all right about it. Now, what does that mean? One, we have, the economy. There's still employment. We haven't dipped below, back before 2000s levels. So folks are working. Our wages are stagnant. But the point of all of these statistics, it really ties back to the psychology of spending in some ways as well, because what these statistics tell us is, yes, declining savings, more debt, but then we also see that spending continues to be on the rise. So what we're trying to do is look at these numbers, follow some of these trends, make sense of this, and kind of challenge ourselves about the psychology of spending. So if you think about this series of statistics that I laid out, really what I'm talking about here is, if we are entirely rational, okay, we would say if our savings is declining, then we don't want to spend any more money. But that's not what those numbers actually tell us. So there's more to this story. And to understand that story and understand the psychology of spending, we start to look at the science of this notion of cognitive bias. So I want to spend just a second here thinking about just a purely rational versus what we might call these cognitive biases, okay? So we look at record credit card debt, for instance. We see those numbers on the rise, credit card delinquencies. Again, we see that the student loan payments are challenging, yet we still see spending. We're still seeing more and more credit card debt accumulated, so we're using the cards. Again, in a purely rational framework, we would say to ourselves, thinking about the psychology of spending, we might say, if I do X, spend more money on my credit card, the long-term debt repayment continues just to escalate. So we would always think in irrational terms, well, I won't do that. I'll stop making those choices. But what we find through cognitive research is that our decisions are influenced by the information that we pay attention to, and that we actually have cognitive biases. And I'll try to explain basically what this means. Cognitive biases, when we think about these frames in which we use to reason, these shortcuts, it's described here in the literature as systematic occurrences, inclinations or dispositions that skew or distort information. It changes the way we make decisions, that we have inaccurate or suboptimal or simply wrong outcomes. Now, what does all that really mean? Again, this differentiation between rational, if I do X, a certain amount of spending, I would get more debt, versus the idea that I shortcut based on observation and experience, or just certain biases towards preferences that take me down the wrong path. And the bottom line is that we just wind up spending more money. And we're going to go through a whole range of these different cognitive biases here in a few moments. But it's really fascinating as you go through these next number of slides, as we work together through these next number of slides. I want you to kind of take mental note and ask yourself, does this sound familiar? Do I have some of these biases? We all do. And some of us have different levels of bias when it comes to our decision making and how it affects our personal finances. I certainly have mine. I'll point those out as we go along. But again, as you follow through some of the cognitive bias science, make a mental note there. Ask yourself, where do I fall within some of these structures? And then as we move forward, you'll see where we might be able to change some of that behavior. So again, we've kind of differentiated between just a purely rational model. If I do these things, it leads to that outcome. We would hope that that would just end our inclinations. It doesn't. Our minds think differently. So we go down and we start looking at cognitive bias, okay? So here, let's just pose this question for a moment, okay? Why is it so hard then, despite all those statistics that we laid out, why is it so hard for us to actually save money, stop our spending, and just actually save? So the science tells us this. We're impatient, and that we often do not think about the long-term consequences of spending. Now, there's a lot of research that goes into understanding us as consumers, and the evidence shows that firms exploit our own biases, our consumer biases that we have, and in pricing goods and services, contract designs, and market decisions. So one that you would want to be aware of immediately thinking about this type of research is what we might call a present bias. That is, you're thinking about only the moment, okay? And what this really, why this is so important is it shifts our decision-making away from the long term and has us focus very narrowly on what's before us now, the inclination towards the immediate, okay? So this will make a lot more sense as we move through, but this is the first kind of term that I really want you to kind of start to think about in terms of your own behavior. How focused are you on the immediate as opposed to the long term? So thinking about, that savings goal, it's often difficult for us sometimes to think about a long-term savings goal because we're so focused on whatever that inclination is for us at the moment, our present bias. Now, second bias that I want you to think about is what we call projection bias. So this is what we refer to as we overestimate how much our future selves will share the same beliefs, values, and behaviors as our current selves. So we make short-sighted decisions. So I wanted to give you kind of an example, kind of a simple example of where this happens. And I'm certainly guilty of this happening myself. The grocery store, okay? So when you think about this bias, this projection bias, again, it's overestimating, your future self, okay? Now, what do we mean by that? So imagine you go to the grocery store, you're starving, you want to get something, you wind up going down the snack aisle, you fill your cart up with all this stuff, okay? So when you get home, you realize that maybe you bought too many things, that you're not hungry anymore. And you start to question, you're like, wow, how can that be? I was starving when I got to the store, and now I've got all this junk food in my cart. The idea there is that now that you have all this stuff, you don't really want it anymore. Okay, so this projection bias, the way you see yourself at that moment is not the way you see yourself after a decision is made. Okay, and this can happen in a lot of different scenarios, but projection bias is another one of these kind of concepts that I want you to wrap your mind around, where you think about how that can shift, where you go from a short-term decision as opposed to saying, I could have paused on some of those purchases that I made at the store. So is there any way to really avoid that? And part of what we'll see with cognitive bias is it's not always easy to avoid. It's part of the challenge, and what I hope you get from our presentation today is how to be more aware of it and how to control it. We can't entirely avoid these cognitive biases, but what we can do is we can be more aware and learn to control our decision making by being aware of what these concepts are and why it generally is going to cause us to have more debt and create further overspending. So a couple things just to recap on a couple of those key terms that I pointed out. And again, making you aware of these concepts, take note as we go through. Again, present bias, that tendency to value things that are right in the near future, okay? Another closely related concept of this is what we call hyperbolic discounting. Now, we overstate the value of the immediate reward. Okay, so there's a lot of research on this as well. When we see that the majority of us have this bias, with 74% of the people who choose short-term gains over long-term gains, and has a direct effect on our financial decisions, where this bias can basically cause us from, again, being able to either pay down debts or to really increase our overall spending, or I'm sorry, our overall savings, being able to meet those long-term goals. So we have to be aware of these types of concepts. Now, when you think about hyperbolic discounting, I'll show you later on where this is so important in the market and how consumers are very well tuned in to how we think as consumers along this concept when they do pricing for goods and services. And you'll see some clear examples about that. But the basic idea is that in our minds, we tend to overstate discounts. And you'll see that here in a few moments. Again, getting us further and further into debt. So when we think about these concepts, one way that these concepts have been applied, taking it from this theoretical concept to market practices. Make no mistake that those that are selling goods and services are very well tuned into our minds and how we think about money. So I looked at a study from, I looked at many studies on this, but there was particularly good studies from Harvard School of Economics that looks at how we make decisions, how we purchase items, and why our price points are so important. And just let me share a couple of findings with you. It says here that consumption is driven not so much by the actual cost of a paid for product as its perceived cost. Okay, perceived cost. What you're going to find is when we talk further about cognitive bias and decision making is our perceptions. Again, our perceptions are key. The perception is influenced by the manner in which the product is priced. And when we're thinking about products and services, you will start to see that there's a real science between our perception of the value of an item and how that's marketed to us, and then our own perception of how we value a particular item. So this has a lot to do with whether we purchase that item or whether we overspend for items. Now, one way to think about this and try to change our minds when it comes to these biases that we have, a couple things here. Looked at cash versus credit cards. Okay, so when we think about the value of an item, let's say we're thinking in short-term gain, we want that particular item, we perceive it to be a good item, priced at a very good rate. Whether it is or it's not, our perception is that we believe we're getting a deal. If you find yourself that you're moving into overspending and that's become a problem for you, here what the science will tell us is that we can focus, at least on this notion between cash and credit cards. When you think about cash, there's that immediate function of us paying in a way that basically we feel the pain of paying more immediate, as opposed to using a credit card, which kind of pushes the payment further down the road. So it definitely changes when you think about the psychology of disconsumption or overspending, cash spending versus just using credit cards. There's a lot of psychology behind this. So valuing items and paying them with cash is very different than financing things long-term on credit cards. It can really shift behavior. You find yourself overspending, moving towards more of a cash system and feeling that immediate loss, as opposed to financing something longer term. Now, they've done a lot of studies on this outside of just actual purchases. One of the couple studies I looked at was looking at, how you might purchase concert tickets or theater tickets, things like that. So if you want to really value an item, in this particular case in the research, what they looked at was they would say, okay, you would perceive that you would get more of your money's worth if you use cash to purchase those theater tickets as opposed to using a credit card. Did you go that night? Did you even go to the theater? If you used the cards, you may not even gone and used the tickets. But when they looked at folks that actually paid cash, that really changed the way that they valued that particular purchase. So they were more likely to be there. They used the tickets more. and they made certain that they got their money's worth. So again, understanding, just how we perceive items. The market is very much in tune with these types of purchases that we make, whether it's tickets or any other items that we buy. Pricing, very important, and then how we perceive value. All those factors go in to how we will either make decisions to spend, use cash, or credit cards. So I'm going to throw a couple of interesting terms at you here from the literature. I'm going to break these terms down in simpler. I'm using terms that are jargon from the literature. They actually explain very simple concepts, I believe. So let's think for a moment again about how we spend money. We know that that the literature would tell us that there's a certain level of joy or pain that comes with spending money. So when we think about consumer behavior, that there's emotions involved in how we spend. Okay, so we'll break this down eventually into what's called anticipated and anticipatory emotions. But the idea here is that this emotional response to money falls into what we call hedonic adaptation. Okay, now this is a very interesting term. Take note of that term, but what it basically means is the psychological forces that influence our underlying acts of spending is happiness. Okay, there's a pleasure-pain principle in terms of how this functions. It's really interesting how this research, I believe, functions, because when we look at the act of spending money, research looks at this and says, well, it's not neutral. An act of spending money has consequences that we have perceived gains or losses. And this is that notion of hedonic outcomes. Again, I don't want to get lost in terms, but it's this idea that there's this pleasure-pain principle that's involved in spending money, okay? And that we always feel our losses more than we do gains. Now, I really want you to focus on that concept for a second, that we would feel our losses more than we feel gains. We're gonna return to that concept in a moment, but when we're thinking about purchases, that emotional response, okay? Here it says, you drop a $20 bill down the storm sewer, you'd feel worse than finding $20 on the street. Well, yeah, that seems to make pretty much sense to us. But that perception of a loss, you'll see, influences maybe why we don't save as much money as we could. I found that to be a fascinating concept when you think about, this idea of just loss in itself, and whether or not these gains are actually felt in terms of it, savings being something that's either a painful experience or something where we actually see gains moving forward. This will be more clear here in a moment. So a couple terms here, again, we think about our behavior and think about spending itself. I thought these two concepts were really interesting. I fall into one, I'll share that with you. When we think about anticipated versus what they call anticipatory expectations. So here what we're talking about, if you fall into what's called an anticipated, here you as a person, you would experience I'll just read this to you. The effect experienced as a result of a given purchase does not simply start at the moment the money is spent. There are emotions felt much prior to the purchase and which continue to reverberate long into the future. So what does that mean? So an anticipated emotion means that when you take possession of that item, you gain, joy from having that item, as opposed to anticipatory emotions, which are basically emotions that you experience at the very moment you are considering the purchase. So now I fall into this latter part with anticipatory. It's the idea of experience. I ruminate on the purchase. Do I want to do these things? Do I want to make a purchase? Whereas someone here under an anticipated outcome may take the approach that they would say, okay, the experience itself is really getting it in my hand. It's an anticipated emotion. I buy the item, I have it in my hand. Versus someone here like myself, where it's that experience of saying, okay, you know, how it feels once I get that item, not even necessarily having it at the time. So you think about these two concepts and maybe kind of apply that to your own thinking. You know, do you find yourself being the person who wants the purchase more immediate, the anticipated, or do you find yourself ruminating on purchases? You know, do you walk yourself through different emotions in order to make that purchase? And you'll see where this concept, where it's anticipated or anticipatory, leads us essentially into two broad groups, either spendthrifts or tightwads. So bear with me, folks. I know we're covering some psychological terms and some different it says a lot about where we fall in terms of being a spendthrift or a tightwad. Okay, so a spendthrift will focus on what they'll gain from spending money, but ignore all the costs. So they wind up spending too freely on purchases. And that happiness impact, you know, what we call the hedonic impact, that happiness you get from that purchase, it's fleeting. So with a spendthrift, what can happen is they will wind up, again, they want that anticipated response. They purchase an iPhone, you purchase something new, clothing, whatever it may be. They focus entirely on spending the money, but they ignore the costs. And then what happens in most cases is that we wind up not even really having long-term gains from it. We don't have the happiness. We can't buy our happiness by being a spendthrift. Okay. Now, tightwads, they focus on the losses involved. Okay. Not those immediate gains, but the losses involved. I tend to be a tightwad. So we focus on the losses involved when spending money, and then they'll often refuse to spend money that might nonetheless yield, you know, some type of happiness or hedonic gains. So, you know, really focus on these two concepts as you think about your own spending. You know, do you fall into this category, this idea where it's that anticipated response? I want it. I have that present bias. I have it now. Or do you fall into this other category where it's more anticipatory and you're ruminating on those things? That leads you probably, in most cases, based on the research, to be more of a tightwad. You're thinking about opportunity costs. You know, that if you do something, what do you lose by making that particular purchase? That makes you a tightwad. You're always thinking about this opportunity cost that is there. So in this case, what we're looking at here is eventually, whether you're a tightwad or whether you're a spendthrift, we come to this concept called the pain of paying. Okay, so long story short, eventually we have to pay our debts. Eventually we have to pay for the purchases that we've made. But the question here is, why do spendthrifts who experience the least pain of paying, that is, they don't really think about that, and those who should be reaping some rewards from their unrestrained spending, you know, show no gains in happiness relative to, you know, their overall. They continue to spend, but why are they so unconflicted about it? So the research here would just basically look at it, this what we call forecasting error, okay, failing to anticipate how quickly they'll have to adapt to the future. So what this really means is that when we think about being either a tightwad or a spendthrift, you know, tightwads, again, thinking about more focused on the opportunity cost and what they may be giving up if they make that purchase, as opposed to someone who falls into that spendthrift category, which is searching for that gain, however fleeting that experience may be. So you really have to take note of those things. So again, I'm going to go back to this pain of paying concept. Again, cash payments versus credit cards. If you break this into just simple terms, cash payments being immediate. The money, once it leaves our hands, it's in someone else's possession. That's immediate. So you recognize that the pain of paying means you're paying that now, as opposed to credit cards, again, which are more long-term and allows you to forego making the payment over a longer period of time. But it only forestalls the inevitable. Eventually, we all experience, quote, the pain of paying, or just having to pay our debts. So let's give you an example where this can be, you can kind of challenge your own thinking on this and meet this concept. Here, what they've looked at, you think about an all-inclusive resort, okay? So if you're finding yourself someone who's just overspending, you want to shift, one thing you might want to think about, and this is just an example, you think about, paying everything up front. So you just acknowledge the payment up front, but then you consume later. So they talk about an all-exclusive, resort where you bundle everything up front and you pay, and then you consume at some other point. The point of all of this is that you've made yourself happy by just paying something up front, and you realize that this is a way to shift your overall spending. If you think about a purchase that you would make now, a cash payment up front versus longer term debt that you experience in credit card debt, that's very difficult for us oftentimes to wrap our minds around that concept, because we want the immediate as opposed to having to forego that purchase over a longer period of time. So pain of paying, we all have that experience at some point. The point of all of this, though, is to place you in this broad category to understand why you make the decisions and how you reason about them, and whether you fall in to whether that's spendthrift category, or do you acknowledge the opportunity costs and kind of fall into that tightwad scenario where it shifts your overall assumptions about spending and future gains. And that's something that you have to set and work through yourself and recognize in order to really make the transition, in the psychology of spending. So to put this, right from here, what I want to do is to give you some very concrete examples. We've been living now for the last 30 minutes or so in a theoretical world. So I'm going to try to make this a little more aware to us. However fun that is to kind of spend time in those theoretical concepts, try to give you some examples now of where you can really apply this and be aware of these biases and what this means for overspending. Okay, so the first one that I want us to look at, and this is taking those broad theoretical concepts and then looking at bias, is what we would call delayed reward discounting. Now, again, my challenge to you is to ask yourself, does this feel familiar? Do I find myself kind of in this realm? Is this some of these shortcuts that I use in my own spending? So delayed reward discounting is a preference for smaller, more immediate rewards as opposed to larger delayed rewards, okay? A lot of times this falls into, this is basically people that are just unwilling to pause on purchases, okay? They can't delay the reward, they want it now. Okay, we talked about present bias, very similar to that concept, seeing purchases only in the short term. So this falls in, again, to a lot of folks who may have impulsive purchases. So that immediate trigger, bam, I've got to have it now. That anticipated response, that emotional response that you have, this is a great example of that. And this is where you have to exercise some type of impulse control, okay? That willingness to delay gratification. And that's really the challenge for many of us, is that when we think about those purchases, can I really do that? Can I shift myself from someone who makes emotional purchases as maybe a spendthrift? Can I delay those purchases and kind of shift my behavior? Now, there's some tricks we're going to do later that can challenge our own thinking, but part of this, again, being aware that this is happening and being aware of your emotional response as you're spending money. So impulse control, very, very important. But delayed reward discounting, the concept is just basically understanding that it's the unwillingness to delay gratification. Another area that can get us into trouble, another bias that we have would be what we call the scarcity principle, okay? So in this case, what we're looking at, so we perceive something to be scarce, and that makes it all the more appealing, all the more desirable to us, okay? So we can reason through this process. I've certainly done this myself, where, you may think, if you're someone who's a collector, or you're thinking that something is scarce, or an item is out there that you think that will not be there for very long at this price point, the scarcity principle begins to trigger how you respond to money. It's that emotional response. So here what we're looking at, a couple examples of this might be, limited time offer, only 2 left at this price. Those types of triggers, again, folks being very tuned in to how we think about money. You can see the marketing here, limited offers, only 2 left, get it now, once it's gone, limited run, all those sorts of things. That's the concept of the scarcity principle. And, failing to recognize that means that we move quickly and we purchase, whereas if we could have paused, we probably would have saved ourselves money. So be aware of the scarcity principle in your own decision making and thinking. Does this apply to you? Sunk cost fallacy is another great one. This is basically anytime that the concept here is that anytime that we're spending time, money, energy on something, we don't want to walk away from it. We want to reap rewards from it. We want to see that it actually meant something. Okay. Another way of saying this sometimes might be that you throw good money after bad. You want to recoup your losses in some way. And this comes in all sorts of scenarios. I mean, this could be housing renovations. This could be fixing your car. It could be purchases for your business. It could be all sorts of examples. But the concept here really is that, we've spent something and we continue to spend money or energy or time on something, and things are just not happening. It's going nowhere. And it's a failure to recognize that we're not ever going to get that gain or to get a limited gain, that we continue to just throw money, good money after bad, or our time, our energy after something that's just not producing a reward or a strong outcome. So that's that concept of sunk cost fallacy. Being aware of that means that we can turn that trigger off, or at least be aware of it and recognize when enough is enough. It's a sunk cost. We've sunk the time and energy into it. Now it's time to move forward and just take a different direction and avoid overspending. Anchoring, another great concept. Okay, this happens all the time. Again, very much in the psychology of spending. We talked about the Harvard study and just recognizing those price points and the emotional attachment that we have towards valuing or perceiving the value of particular items. So when we think about anchoring, this basically is where we anchor on a certain price point. We get stuck on a certain price point. So let me give you an example here. You're shopping for an item with a purchase price of $100. That item is marked down to $50. Your mind is stuck on the anchor, that $100 price point. So when you hear $50, you're immediately triggered. You're thinking, wow, I'm getting a great deal here. It's $50. This tends to be $100 regardless anywhere else. Well, may or may not be. Okay, so we're concentrating on the anchor, and we're actually thinking that we're saving all this additional money, but really not thinking about the $50 that we're actually spending. Okay, so that anchor principle, hyper focusing on that initial price point, we see this with these perceived deals all the time. Okay, just be aware of that in your spending and how that may trigger that emotional response or that psychological response to spending. One last example here, what we call social facilitation. So when we think about this concept, think about being around others. This concept here says that, yes, being around others, there's an example here that you're challenged with others. They may make you more productive. You may be better at any number of different activities. Applying this to a financial concept, you'd say, okay, an auction is a good way of thinking about this. You think about eBay, that psychological arousal that, others are trying to vie for that particular item or that particular thing. You might even think about this as keeping up with the Joneses in some way as well. But because of the group, you make decisions psychologically, in terms of how the group functions, causing you to make decisions that would be suboptimal or wrong. Okay, you wind up overspending. So, again, triggering that psychological arousal, that decision-making process. So be aware of that as well. When we're all vying for this particular item or trying to have, function within that group, that can cause us to have spending problems as well. So we've covered a lot of theory and a lot about terms and cognitive bias and things like that. So I'm hoping that this is starting to make a little more sense in terms of just the rationale behind some of this work and what it actually means. So what do we do about this? Can we actually, correct present bias and some of these biases that we have and how we our decision making? What do we do? Is it possible to make that happen? Well, it is. First thing I would say is let's be aware of present bias, that idea that we're tending towards the immediate. One of the things that we can do, and this can be done through the credit union, is that we can automate the process. Okay, so let's say that we want more savings. We're aware of those triggers, the emotional triggers, that anticipated or anticipatory response and how it makes us feel, whether we have it now or whether we delay. These things now, a good example of this is savings in itself. How can we trick our minds to actually make this work to our benefit? So let me give you an example. Sometimes for many folks, savings can feel more like a loss than a gain. Again, if we're entirely rational, we would say, yeah, open an account, keep putting money in there, the account builds up, everything's great. But for many of us, the more we put into that savings, it actually starts to feel like a loss more than a gain. That's the concept of loss aversion, okay? So what it means is that we feel the loss, what we're putting in the account, more than we actually feel the gain or what's accumulating in that account. So what do we do? So in a lot of the research, we look at these psychological nudges, or we look at automation to kind of make us more successful. So one of the things you could do, technology becomes our friend. So we use we automate the process, okay? So rather than thinking, we may not be entirely able to turn that off in our minds that actually savings is not a loss, but a gain. And if that doesn't quite make sense to us, we use the ability to transfer payments and use automatic transfers to just kind of stop thinking about it. So the credit union allows you to do that. And I would encourage you to reach out where you can automate some of your finances to where you can have that money pulled into a separate account to rebuild your personal savings. Again, kind of tricking our minds so we're not really thinking, reasoning about the so-called loss, and just letting automation rule the day. Just pull the money from our account, put it into the separate account. We set it, we forget it. It's not on our minds any longer. Another example that I wanted to point out here, just in terms of like savings and thinking about how this was done, they used a similar approach. Vanguard used a similar approach to do this with retirement savings. Again, folks felt like the actual money that they were putting into things was a loss, that notion of loss aversion. So in order to do this, to kind of get that out of our thinking, we used automation to kind of set the accounts up, automatically enroll, automatically deduct certain portions that you want to invest at a higher rate in 2024. We do that through automation. Again, the savings went, you can see on the statistic here, 47 and 93%. Just folks were becoming more and more confident in that approach and earning more long term. So automation, if you're not doing this now, you want to certainly set up a budget and to do this work through the tools that we have at the credit union. I encourage you to think about doing that. So lastly, let's think about how we can take some action here and put all this into practice. Again, being aware, we've talked a lot about, cognitive biases and how that shapes our decision making. That rational role we talked about versus these shortcuts based on maybe observation experience or our preferences, that emotional preference that we have, those types of things, that shortcuts and changes the way that we think about money, how we wind up getting into overspending. I'm going to encourage you to imagine, and this is what the research would tell us, imagine your future self. Imagine yourself where rather than being kind of controlled by these biases, that you use automation to kind of set things up and automate that process for your savings, accumulate more money in an account that maybe you'd pay off debts in the current year. Imagine, again, being aware, you have to kind of project yourself into the future. Where do you want to be? Having a very clear goal of where that's at, and using technology to help you get there. And then also being very, very clear to yourself about what your savings goals are. The clearer those goals can be, the more likely you're going to reach them. We've talked about budgeting in the past, but to do this work, you certainly want to set up a budget. I won't go through these now, but I will encourage you. We've done many presentations on these types of budgets in the past. Setting up something simple, or ultimately getting to what we call the money flow budget. This is the budget where we would say you set it and forget it, particularly if you're going to build an account, but let automation do work for you. This is a great way to do this through the credit union. Just automatic set up those accounts, build that fund through time, pay off debt long term. Now, I want to close just by saying, I know we've covered a lot of theoretical concepts today, and I'm hoping that this picture is getting a little clearer. It's not easy moving our way through some of these theoretical concepts and new terminology and those sorts of things, but I want us to think for a moment as we kind of move towards a close about what doesn't work. When we hear this advice a lot, one of the reasons that we're doing this presentation today is to really get us thinking about the psychology of money and what those emotional responses are, the emotional triggers, the cognitive, the way we reason about money, really to get you to think about those concepts and be aware of them. But it also, I think, highlights sometimes certain messages that we hear that are maybe not as effective, okay? And I've highlighted that one here, self-restraint. Oftentimes we think about this concept of just saying, okay, we set a budget, you meet that budget, everything's great. This notion of self-restraint. Well, for many of us, because of the way we reason about money or the psychology of spending, self-restraint is simply not enough. That's why we need to be aware of the cognitive side and how it affects our overall decision making. That's where I talked about all the various biases and how that functions in our minds. So self-restraint, oftentimes, if I just say, again, this is kind of that purely rational way of thinking about something. Here's a budget, set that up, meet the budget, everything's done. What this presentation, I hope, means to you is that often is not enough to stop overspending. That this self-restraint in itself in a purely rational way is not enough. We have to be aware of those triggers. We have to be aware of the emotional side. And we have to be aware of that list of interesting terms that I gave you earlier about all of those various biases and how that functions, and why it's so important for us to be, aware of what that means for overall spending or our inability to save. So self-restraint, important, and it works for some folks, but oftentimes the failure is that self-restraint really isn't enough. So what we have to do is we recognize that there are some tricks along the way that we can use to maybe trick our brains in thinking differently, okay? So first is this idea of needs versus strategy. Okay, so behind each thing we want, there's a psychological need that it serves. Okay, and that's an extremely interesting way of thinking about behavioral finance, I think. So our needs, are those needs being met? And that's what drives so much of our actual spending. So we think about a static budget. It's very difficult oftentimes for many of us to meet that budget, because regardless of how good our intentions are, our self-restraint's just not enough. By putting numbers down on paper, it's just not, we can't get over that psychological need that it has to be met, okay? So in this case, what we want to do is I'm going to encourage you to think about those psychological needs, okay? So think about needs and strategy. That need, it's something that's deep inside us. It's important to us, that perceived importance to us, our psychological well-being, we feel it. And then a strategy would be something that we can apply to maybe shift behavior in some way to try to meet that need, but to save us money. And there's lots of strategy that I'll share with you here in a few moments. So we want to get to know our spending. Again, we want to identify those areas that we may be overspending. We've talked a lot about tracking. That still is good practice. Going to encourage you to do that again. You can do that through your bank account. You can also do that through some budget tracking tools I believe that the credit union provides. The GE Money Management tool that's online. Scroll through your credit card expenses. Again, recognize those patterns. You're asking yourself, what need does that fulfill? And if I made those purchases, again, that term hedonic, the pleasure, was there really any pleasure from that? Or did I just wind up being a spendthrift? What gains did I actually make? You really want to dive into that work to identify your own overspending and identify that trigger, that psychological trigger that may be causing that to happen. They call it identifying your pain points. Okay, so this is where you're looking at all those items. What items have you regretted purchasing? What expenses you've been embarrassed to admit, or hide from others or hide from your family. I know that here at Trinity, when I work through budgets, there's all sorts of purchases that folks make, and the spouse, or significant other, they're shocked that these things were done or how far the spending got out of control. Again, you need to identify those pain points. That is, why are you making those purchases? What need does it serve? And then again, working through a budget, categorizing these expenses, but being not just recognizing the purchase that you make, but really being aware of the underlying rationale or why that purchase was made. So that underlying need is one of the most important things that I want you to think about as we kind of close this afternoon, really figuring out what that is. And then, you think about some different strategies. One strategy you'll see here is, there's a lot of different things that I've listed here for you, but these strategies in itself will not be enough if you have not done the hard work of just digging into that underlying psychological need. We've talked a lot about budgeting over the years, and comparison shopping and all these sorts of things, and having automation and tracking accounts. These are all strategies that you can modify your own spending behavior. These all are research-based. They all work if applied over a longer period of time. But again, in closing, what I really want you to focus on is just, set back for a moment and think about some of the theoretical concepts we talked about, and maybe even go back and give this presentation another run so you can kind of think about those cognitive biases. But at the end of the day, what we're hoping to do is to make you successful, that you are more aware of your own spending decisions, and that by being aware of how you reason about money, that you can shift your behavior and just make better financial decisions in 2024. So I'll close there. I know that is a lot of information. Fascinating topic. We've only scratched the surface, and hopefully the presentation was clear, and I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you, Todd. I know we have about 5 or so minutes left of today's webinar, so we'll go ahead and jump into questions. If you have a question, go ahead and submit it using your question feature, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So our first question was pre-submitted. It says, how can learning all of this information help my spending habits?
Yeah, how can it help your spending habits? Yes. Well, I would encourage you, if you look at some of those slides where you talked about cognitive bias, I mean, there's two things for me. First, thank you for working through the presentation today. I know it's a lot of content, but when we think about being aware of, the various biases that we have, that's so important, because all of us have that in some form or fashion. It affects our overall decision making. We're not entirely rational when it comes to decision making. We make choices based on preferences, on emotions, and on perceived value. That's something that I want you to be aware of. So why this is important is that if you know some of these factors, whether it's sunk cost or hyperbolic discounting and some of these terms, just the way that we think about money, you can become more aware of those triggers yourself. So if you know that you fall into this idea where you value, think about anchoring, that concept of anchoring. You're out shopping with the kids, and you see all these cells and you see things that are marked down, or you have this perceived idea that, it was $100, it's been marked down to 50, or $200 and it's marked down, be aware that there's probably other opportunities in the market for you to save money on similar items. You can comparison shop, you can do other things. It doesn't have to be that item, and it doesn't have to be right now. Doesn't, so it's being aware of those kind of psychological functions of our mind and those psychological triggers. If we can just walk away, even, like, I've listed here, just not making an impulse purchase, being and practicing that more, being aware of the concept and practicing those concepts, eventually we can we can't entirely maybe remove you from being a spendthrift, but we can actually save you money long term. You're going to save more, and you're going to stop overspending the more aware of these concepts you are, and how you create an emotional response to your overall spending. So that awareness, if anything else, is why we want to do this today.
And then our next question says, how do I instill different spending behaviors in my children how do I instill different spending behaviors in my children than my parents instilled in me?
Yeah. Well, again, I think a couple things. I mean, one, the more, with your children, the more you can educate children about, it's very difficult sometimes to get around present bias with children, because most children, I think, want something right now. So if we think short-term versus long-term gain, that is something I think that is a very hard concept for our children to understand, and for many adults as well. So one of the strategies you might take, again, if you can work in a way to make savings feel less like a loss. We talked about loss aversion, where the perception is, if I'm putting money into this account, I actually have less money to spend. So the perception there would be, I'm just not gonna put as much money into the account. I favor spending as opposed to savings. One way that you might be able to do that is just to be able to work with the kids, create an account with your children, set up some small savings goal, and then, have rewards that, you can match some of their savings through time, so that they start to see that actual savings goal producing a real outcome. Okay, so what you're ultimately trying to do is create a habit. You're trying to create a new habit. So you're shifting them away from short-term thinking to actually realizing or noticing what the ultimate goal would be. So it's a very tricky question. But I think the more that you could work through the bank, through banking services, the credit union, setting up an account, kind of matching the account sometimes with savings goals, and just trying to instill within the children, why savings goals are important, and really being able to automate that process, you're going to create some very strong habits for kids long term. I'm not sure, how old the children are, but you're going to be able to create habits that will last for them for a very long time, and will probably influence their entire financial lives, because that's actually socialization, and that plays a large role in whether or not your children will perceive banking services, financial services, savings, what their perceptions long term of those things will be. So very important for you to be involved in that process.
All right, thank you, Todd. That is going to conclude our Q&A session for today. If you have any questions that come up after today's webinar, feel free to reach out to Todd directly, or you can always email events@gecreditunion.org, and we will get your question over to Todd for you. But with that is going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.